I ask that this story remains anonymous, please. I live in a small town located about 20 minutes from Manhattan. I have lived in this town since 2009, which isn't much time compared to most of the others in my community. Although this is a small town, it doesn't have that typical small town vibe. I attribute this to it being next to other larger towns. We don't have a high school, so the kids go to a nearby town, but in our town everyone knows each other. Living in a small town with a high socioeconomic status, practically nothing ever happens. Since I've lived here, almost nothing has happened. There was someone who tried to rob a house, but when they saw the owner, they ran away. However, there was always something I never understood. Once I was playing soccer with my friends at school on a Saturday, and from the main field you could see a cell phone tower and from other angles a water tower. One of my friends asked about the boy who fell from the water tower a long time ago. My friend's father fell silent and had a strange expression. He avoided talking about it, but they finally agreed that we would leave it at that. The topic came up a few more times over the years, but it always ended with the same conclusion. A boy made a bad decision and fell from the water tower. A few weeks ago, I went for a walk with my dad on a trail in the woods. Where I come from, it's easy to experience both the city and nature. When I go out, I often drive through a wooded area known as the reserve. There are some trails in the reserve, but there was always one that particularly interested me. It has a parking lot with a path surrounded by trees. It looks best when there's fog. So when my dad and I went to the trail, it was very foggy. The eerie effect made the tower look incredible. I don't have a picture of the tower in the fog, but I do have a picture of the trail leading to it, and that's where my inspiration comes from. I asked about it, and it seems to be something well known in my town. One of my teachers, who has been in the town since before my parents were born, and some of my friends told me the real story. I discovered that the murder was even more horrific than I ever imagined. It turns out a boy named Greg Sanders, around my age, killed his parents and then jumped from the water tower. I went there and didn't even know what had happened, though I had some reliable sources. I decided to research online during recess that day, and I found exactly what I was looking for and even more. I found a website that shocked me. It was a page dedicated to people who visit the water tower, nicknamed the Suicide Tower. I learned that in my small town, there's a paranormal tourist attraction. Then I discovered what really happened. Here's a snippet from the top of the webpage. The story of the Suicide Tower goes like this. On January 15, 1976, Greg Sanders, 15 years old, from Hillside, New Jersey, murdered his parents with an axe, slit his wrists, and then jumped from the water tower to his death. No clear motive was discovered for any of the murders or his suicide. However, some believe he killed his parents to save them from the pain of his suicide. This left me in shock. I kept scrolling down to the comments, and one of them should send chills down anyone's spine. It was in Mountainside, New Jersey, not Hillside. He was my neighbor, and I rode the school bus with him for a few years. He seemed normal. This boy did something so horrible and seemed normal. This poor boy must have been so desperate to end his life. It's widely believed that Greg Sanders killed his parents to save them from the sadness of his death. But that's not all I found. I found an old newspaper article with a statement from the police chief at the time. Here's what it said. The first parent to fall was Greg's father. He knocked over his chair and then staggered across the room toward the kitchen as he tried to escape. The boy pursued him, hitting him with an axe the entire time. Finally, the man collapsed in the kitchen. He had been struck 8 or 9 times, said former police chief Mullen. It was speculated that Greg killed his mother when she came downstairs later. As I said, there were no warning signs. One person said he seemed normal. The article also said that Greg was an honor student. In his suicide note, titled "To Whom It May Concern," Greg Sanders took responsibility for the double homicide. He also expressed regret for his actions. The article stated that Mullen said the neighbors didn't hear any unusual noises or screams. The tragic event shocked my community. No one could have seen this coming, and if something had happened, no one could have suspected that this boy could have done what he did. The Ludington Daily asked school authorities, and they said Greg was well liked by his teachers and peers. A little after 9 o'clock that night, after handwriting his suicide note and slitting his wrists, Greg Sanders fell from a height of 45 meters to his death. He was found by the police in my small town 4 days later. It was completely unknown to others that there was a problem, and because of that, he couldn't get help. Former county prosecutor Peter McCord stated, if there was a problem, only the parents knew about it. I started this investigation to find out what really happened in my small town. I ended up reaching the same conclusion I've known for a long time. Even a family that had the resources to help their child proves how tedious and stigmatized the mental health system in the United States is and how it hasn't changed. Being a police officer in a small town in Minnesota is probably not the most exciting career out there, but it's not bad either. In fact, it's a relatively peaceful and safe job compared to being in law enforcement in one of the big cities, like New York or Los Angeles, where the action is. In the town where I live, there are about 10,000 people. It's far away, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of open farmland, and the only real crime that happens is fairly minor. Occasionally, some rowdy farmers get into a fight in one of the 3 bars downtown, teenage vandalism, small thefts, a drunk driver, disorderly conduct from time to time, the rare home break-in, that sort of thing. The only really serious incidents I've had to deal with were a couple of cases of domestic violence and physical assault. But even that is fairly typical, I suppose, and it doesn't happen often. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one case that still haunts me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As I was saying, I live in a small, quiet town, boring, some might say. The kind of rural farming community you've probably driven through on the highway, headed somewhere more interesting without giving it a second thought or a backward glance. The kind of place where nothing ever happens out of the ordinary, you probably thought. And mostly you'd be right. But there's one case I can't get out of my head. One case that still makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. One case I can't explain no matter how much I try to rationalize it. What happened to old Mrs. Garrity? 7 years ago. I had been a police officer for 5 years when it happened in the early spring of 2014. There were only 5 cops in the entire town's police department. Me, my partner Jerry, Pete, and Vance, who worked the night patrol, and the police chief, plus Karen, an older woman who was a retired librarian and worked part-time as the dispatcher. The police department was located in the town hall and consisted of 2 offices, one for the chief and one for us, and 3 cells in the back, which were never all occupied at the same time. It was a cloudy, rainy afternoon in late March or early April. Jerry and I were in our patrol car on a routine round through town when Karen's voice came over the radio, telling us there was a possible 1082 in progress at Mrs. Garrity's house on Turner Street. For those who don't know, 1082 is the police code for a home invasion. We responded and changed direction, heading toward Mrs. Garrity's house. I wasn't too worried about the call. I already had a pretty clear idea who had made it. Eileen Garrity was an elderly widow who lived in a rundown farmhouse on the outskirts of town. She was probably about 65 or 70 years old and had lived alone since her husband had died of a stroke 3 years earlier. They had 2 grown children, but both lived out of town and never visited her. Since her husband's death, she had developed something of a reputation for being eccentric, to put it politely, or crazy, to put it more bluntly. She was a recluse who rarely left her house and had her groceries delivered once a week. Basically a crazy cat lady without the cats. The reason she was considered crazy was that she had become quite erratic and paranoid since she became a widow and had called the police department several times about everything from hearing intruders moving around in her attic to seeing UFOs in her cornfield. There were probably at least a dozen other incidents too, and of course, all her calls turned out to be false alarms. The burglars she claimed were hiding in her attic turned out to be a couple of raccoons that had snuck in under the roof, and the UFOs were probably just planes flying out of the National Guard base about 50 miles to the west. Jerry and I, along with Pete and Vance, had visited her house during our respective shifts. We never got frustrated with her or hassled her about it, and we usually humored her, inspecting her house and property to calm her nerves. She would relax, thank us, we'd leave, and the process would repeat itself in a few weeks or a couple of months. Honestly, our infrequent visits to her house were probably the only really exciting thing about what was otherwise a pretty dull and boring job. When we'd tell the chief about Mrs. Garrity's latest emergency Bigfoot lurking in her yard or a giant anaconda stalking her basement, he'd just shake his head sadly. When Vance and Pete had to deal with her, they'd tell us all about their latest experience when we saw them at the end of their shift and the start of ours. They'd usually smirk and Pete would twirl his finger next to his temple before heading out. Jerry and I just felt sorry for the old lady. It couldn't have been easy for a frail, nervous, and lonely woman to live completely alone in that old, crumbling house with no friends or close family. I suspected she might be going senile or maybe entering the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. We worried about her living there all alone, nearly a mile from her nearest neighbor. If her health suddenly took a turn for the worse, or she had an accident and couldn't call for help, there wouldn't be much we could do about it. A couple of times I looked up her son and daughter's phone numbers and tried to call them to talk about their mother's situation and see if she could be placed in a nursing home or mental health facility. But the one time I managed to get her son on the phone while I was explaining his mother's situation, he cut me off, saying he was very busy at the moment and would call me back. He then abruptly ended the conversation. He never did call me back. After that, they were always busy and never returned any of the voicemail messages I left for them. So Jerry and I turned onto Turner Street and drove up to Mrs. Garrity's house on that gray and rainy afternoon in late spring, sure that the old woman was overreacting once again to something relatively minor, and her imagination was getting the best of her. She was waiting for us outside on her porch when we pulled up. I'll never forget how she looked. It shocked me. She had already been a thin and frail woman the other times we had gone, but we hadn't seen her in probably a couple of months since her last false alarm, and she had changed drastically since then. Now she was gaunt, almost skeletal, with sunken cheeks and dark circles around her red-rimmed and hollow eyes. Her gray hair was matted and didn't look like it had been washed in days, maybe weeks, and the dress she was wearing was wrinkled and dirty. Her physical appearance was alarming enough, but there was also something about the way she was looking at us with those dark, doll-like eyes that seemed to look through us and beyond all at once. It reminded me of old photos I had seen of U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, that blank, empty stare of someone who has been through more horror than any normal person should have to endure. Jerry and I exchanged a look of amazement, then got out and approached the old woman. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Garrity?" Jerry asked kindly, trying to keep an informal tone. "There's something in my house," she told us in a flat, toneless voice. She was trembling slightly, a woman on the verge of total physical and mental collapse. The way she said it, not someone, but something, made me raise an eyebrow. "We'll just wait here and we'll take a look and make sure everything's okay, all right?" I told her, trying not to sound too condescending. I glanced at Jerry and nodded. We drew our guns and walked past Mrs. Garrity, cautiously entering the house. We did a routine sweep of the first floor, guns pointed, then headed upstairs. It only took us about 5 minutes to check the whole house. We had done it so many times before that we already knew the layout by heart, and there were no signs of intruders or any evidence of a break-in. But I did see a lot of other things that deeply unsettled me. For one thing, the place was an absolute mess. The house was already pretty run down, but Mrs. Garrity had still taken pride in how clean she kept it, and it had always been spotless on our previous visits. Now, dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen sink, the countertops were grimy, and trash and dirty laundry littered the floor. I also noticed that Mrs. Garrity's pillow and blankets were rumpled on the couch in the living room. The coffee table in front of the couch was strewn with half-drunk cups of coffee, opened food containers, a Bible, and a rosary. It looked like she had been eating and sleeping in the living room for some time. When we went upstairs, as I suspected, Mrs. Garrity's bed in her bedroom was empty, and the room itself looked like it hadn't been occupied for quite a while. There was also something in the living room that alarmed me a great deal. In one corner was an old double-barrel shotgun that had probably belonged to her late husband. Jerry picked it up, opened it, and found 2 spent shells in the chamber. He removed one, smelled it, and then told me the shotgun had been fired very recently. We also discovered another strange thing. All the mirrors in Mrs. Garrity's house had been smashed, and every closet door had been nailed shut. The one in the downstairs hallway had a large hole in the center, with smaller holes surrounding the splintered wood. You didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to deduce that Mrs. Garrity had fired her husband's shotgun at that door. But why? What the hell had happened here? Jerry gave me a perplexed and questioning look. I shrugged, just as baffled. We finished our inspection of the house, holstered our guns, and turned to leave. Mrs. Garrity was standing in the room behind us, staring at us with that same blank, unnerving expression. We both nearly jumped a foot in the air, startled. Neither of us had seen her come in. Jerry recovered his composure and smiled at her, trying to reassure her. "Well, we don't see any sign of him, Mrs. Garrity. He must have run out the back. You're safe now." She didn't relax or seem relieved like she had all the countless times before when we reassured her. Her face seemed to twitch, and a new look appeared in her eyes. It took me a moment to identify it. It was a look of pure terror mixed with hopelessness. "No," she said in that same strange monotone voice. I'm not safe, he's still here. He's hiding, that's why you didn't find him. And after you leave, he's going to come for me again." Then she started to tremble. She broke down sobbing with complete despair, collapsing into hysterical sobs that shook her entire body. Jerry and I exchanged worried glances. We approached the old woman and comforted her as best we could, guiding her to the couch and sitting her down, trying to calm her. After she had calmed down, we asked her to tell us what had happened. She sat in silence for a few moments, gathering her thoughts. Then she began to speak. As we listened to her story, I felt the temperature in my body gradually drop and a chill ran down my spine. Several times I made eye contact with Jerry, and his expression mirrored mine, disbelief and fear. "It started about a month ago," she began. "That's when I first heard the scratching at the closet door. A soft, slow scratching that seemed to come from inside her closet at night. At first, she had assumed it was probably a mouse or some other small animal, except the sound of the scratching seemed to come from too high up to be a mouse. Every time she opened the closet door, always after the scratching had stopped, there was nothing there. Several times she had been about to open the closet door while the scratching was in progress, to get to the bottom of it once and for all. But every time she grabbed the doorknob, an overwhelming and irrational feeling of unease overcame her, and she couldn't do it. The scratching sounded too deliberate, too soft, too deceptively harmless, like something was trying to lure her into opening the closet door. To be safe, she began locking the closet door every night. Over the next few days, the scratching had grown louder and more intense, as if something were trying to force its way through the wood. One day, she opened the closet door and found claw marks on the other side, claw marks that were nearly 6 feet high, marks that looked like they had been made by nails. The real terror began for Mrs. Garrity about a week after she first heard the scratching noises. One night, she woke up to a voice calling her softly, a voice that seemed to come from the locked closet door in her bedroom. She was confused, even more so because she recognized that voice. It was Bill's voice, her late husband. Bill's voice was begging her to open the closet door, telling her that God had sent him to take her to heaven, where they could be together again. Young like they used to be forever. At this point, Jerry gave me a wide-eyed look from across the couch. "And what happened next?" I asked her softly. "I thought I was dreaming," Mrs. Garrity said. "I thought it had to be a dream. Poor Bill had died 3 years ago, and since I was dreaming, I didn't see any harm in doing what he asked. I got out of bed and walked over to the closet. I reached for the lock, but then I stopped. Something wasn't right. It was Bill's voice, and it sounded perfectly normal. But somehow it was also wrong. The way he was talking, it wasn't how Bill talked. It was like a stranger was using Bill's voice, trying to trick me into opening the closet door. That doesn't make much sense, does it? Actually, nothing she was telling us made any sense, but we only asked her to keep narrating her story. Bill, or whoever was using his voice, kept pleading with her to open the closet. When she refused, the voice changed, becoming rough and belligerent. It angrily demanded that she open the door, and when she still refused, it began shouting at her, using insults and making obscene threats. Things Bill never would have said to her while he was alive, she said, before starting to pound violently on the door. The voice began to change, no longer sounding like her late husband. It grew deeper and more distorted until it no longer sounded human. Terrified, she fled her bedroom and spent the night on the couch downstairs. Eventually, the pounding and the threats stopped. "Mrs. Garrity," Jerry interrupted politely at this point, "why didn't you call the police department when this happened?" She was silent for a moment. Then a small, bitter smile appeared on her lips. "I thought you would think I was just imagining it. I know people in town think I'm a crazy old lady, and I've already made you come out so many times for things that turned out to be nothing. I thought maybe it was all in my head, and I didn't want to bother you about it." Things had escalated quickly from there. The pounding and the threats continued every night. She had been so scared to sleep in her bedroom that she had started sleeping on the living room couch. Then, one night, the pounding started not just on her bedroom closet door, but on every closet door in the house, all at once, as if there were people inside, each one trying to get out at the same time. But it was the same voice in every closet, the same horrible voice. Terrified, she nailed every closet door shut to prevent the thing, whatever it was, from getting out to get her. Then, about 2 weeks ago, something even more terrifying happened. She was in her bathroom washing her hands at the sink when she looked up into the mirror. Here she paused in her account. "What did you see?" Jerry asked her. "I saw him," she said with a strangled sob. "I saw his face instead of mine. He was wearing a black hooded robe, and his face was just a grinning skull, a skull with horns. His eyes were red, the eyes of the devil himself. I don't mean I saw him standing behind me in the mirror, he was in the mirror itself. I felt a shiver run down my spine. He reached out from the mirror, he didn't have hands, he had claws, and he tried to grab me." She threw a bottle of lotion at the mirror, shattering the glass. Then, to be sure, she did the same to all the other mirrors in the house. "How have you been able to stay in this house with all this happening to you?" I asked her. She shrugged sadly. "I don't have anywhere else to go, and no one would take me in. The nights were terrible, but it was always better during the day. At least then she could get a little sleep. It always stopped in the morning and never happened during the day." Suddenly she shuddered. "Until 3 days ago. Then it started happening all the time, day and night. I wasn't safe anymore, no matter what time it was. Everything came to a head that very morning. The pounding had gradually become more violent and louder until all the closet doors were shaking in their frames. Mrs. Garrity knew that, even with the boards nailed over them, it was only a matter of time before that thing broke through. Desperate, she had started praying and reading the Bible, which only made the entity in the closet laugh mockingly at her. Finally, she had taken out Bill's shotgun and fired through the closet door. For a minute, there was no sound, she told us. I started thinking it was finally over. And then I saw those red eyes burning in the dark in the hole the shotgun had made. It chuckled and it said one word. "What word did it say?" I asked her. "Tonight," she replied, and she started trembling. She lowered her head into her hands and began sobbing again. Jerry and I sat in silence for a while, trying to process what she had just told us. We looked at each other, deeply concerned by her story. Neither of us really believed her, of course, but it was clear that the poor woman was deeply disturbed. She was having some kind of nervous breakdown. Maybe her fragile grip on reality had finally snapped, or maybe old age was taking its toll on her mind. One thing was clear, it wasn't safe for her to be alone, especially not here. It wasn't healthy for her. Hell, for all we knew, maybe her paranoia was the result of some kind of dangerous mold that had grown in the house. Jerry and I excused ourselves for a moment and stepped outside to talk privately. We both agreed that she needed help, that she should be committed somewhere, but for now it was best if she stayed somewhere else. We went back inside and told Mrs. Garrity that she would be coming with us. She was going to spend the night in a motel in town, and tomorrow, Jerry added, we would find a priest who would come to exorcise the evil spirit that had been bothering her, getting rid of it once and for all. She broke down in tears again, this time crying with relief, and hugged both me and my partner, thanking us over and over. We took her to a cheap motel in town and checked her in. Her mental state already seemed to have improved in that brief span of time, just by being out of that house. She smiled and told us she couldn't wait to finally have a good night's sleep without having to worry about that thing banging on the doors. I think, mostly, she was just happy not to have to be afraid of the entity she was convinced was lurking in her home. We both smiled at her and said goodbye, getting back into the patrol car and driving away. Our smiles faded as soon as we drove away from the motel. We both liked old Mrs. Garrity, despite all the times she had been a nuisance to the police department with her false calls and erratic behavior. We felt sorry that her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer take care of herself. We told the chief the story when we got back. He sighed sadly and nodded, agreeing that she needed to be committed somewhere. Tomorrow, he and I were going to personally visit her son and daughter to explain what was happening, and if they still refused to do what was necessary, the chief would take it upon himself to make sure Mrs. Garrity got the help she needed. But we never got the chance. The last time we saw Mrs. Garrity was when Jerry and I dropped her off at the motel. Around 4 in the morning the next day, I was woken up by an urgent call from the chief, telling me to get to the motel as soon as possible. He didn't tell me why over the phone, but I already had a sinking feeling it had something to do with Mrs. Garrity. I had a terrible feeling of dread as I got dressed. I wondered if maybe she had taken her own life in that motel room. When I got to the motel, my fears were confirmed when I saw the crime scene tape blocking the door to Mrs. Garrity's room. The chief, along with Jerry, Pete, and Vance, were outside, along with a couple of state police officers and a pair of city detectives. The chief greeted me with a grave expression as I approached. He told me that Mrs. Garrity was gone. At first I thought he meant she was dead, but seeing the solemn look on my face, he clarified. She was gone, literally. I stared at him, confused. I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something that sent a chill of fear into my heart. The chief was scared. He told me he didn't know what to think himself. People in the neighboring rooms had heard blood-curdling screams and sounds of violence coming from Mrs. Garrity's room around 2 a.m, and then, nothing. They called the police department. Pete and Vance were the first to arrive. They knocked on the door, but there was no response, so they forced entry. When they saw what was inside, they called the chief. "What did they find?" I asked. "Maybe you should see for yourself," he said, leading me toward the door and under the crime scene tape. He explained that there were no signs of forced entry, and that the door and windows of the motel room were still locked from the inside when Pete and Vance arrived. I took a look around, feeling a chill run down my spine. Fresh blood was splattered all over the room, on the walls, on the floor, on the bed, even on the ceiling. The blood-soaked sheets had been ripped from the bed, as if someone had been desperately clinging to them as they were dragged out of the bed. There were 10 thin trails of blood on the carpet, leading away from the bed. 10 thin trails of blood that had been made by 10 desperate, terrified fingers, clawing for purchase as their owner was dragged away. I followed the bloody finger marks across the floor, away from the bed, until they ended at the closet. I looked at them, then at the chief. He looked back at me, his face hard and impassive, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I stepped closer to the closet. The door was open. I stood there for a while staring. The closet was empty, completely empty. There wasn't even any blood on the floor. They never found Mrs. Garrity. Let me update you. The last thing I told you was that the Mrs. Garrity case was the most terrifying thing that ever happened to me, and that apart from that, nothing out of the ordinary had happened to me during my career as a police officer in a small, boring town in the middle of nowhere. Well, up until about a week ago, that was mostly true. Mostly. But in light of recent events, I feel like I have a new story I need to share with you. But first, I have to go back a bit and tell you about something that happened about 3 years ago. It was something strange, but at the time I wrote the first story, it didn't seem important enough to mention. Cops get used to dealing with all kinds of weird people, people who report fake crimes and stuff like that, people who confess to murders they didn't commit, etc. I'm sure police departments in big cities have to deal with things like that all the time, but even small-town departments see it every once in a while. It was, I think, late June or early July of 2019. I was on the night patrol at the time. I usually worked days, but I was filling in for Vance because he was getting his appendix out. Joe, a rookie we had hired the year before, was doing the day patrol with my partner Jerry. It was an early summer evening, and I was in the office chatting with the chief and Pete, getting ready for my shift when a woman showed up at the police station surprising us. I say showed up because afterward, when the 3 of us discussed what happened, we all agreed that none of us had seen or heard her enter the room. It was like one moment she wasn't there, and the next moment she was. She was young, maybe about 19 or 20, thin and could have been pretty, but you wouldn't know it looking at her in her current condition. For starters, she was soaking wet, absolutely drenched from head to toe. Her hair was dripping, tangled and hanging around her face, and her dress, which I noticed seemed a little old-fashioned, was saturated. She was panting, completely out of breath, like she had just run a mile, and her eyes were wild, wide with fear. Another thing I noticed was that she was very pale, unnaturally pale. I mean, her skin looked almost bone-white. I guess the 3 of us were pretty taken aback by her appearance for a few seconds. Pete, the chief, and I just stared at her in shock. "Please," she said, "you have to help me." The chief, who had been sitting at his desk working on a puzzle, found his voice. "What seems to be the problem, miss?" he asked a bit awkwardly. "Someone kidnapped me. I managed to escape. I think they were going to kill me." We all exchanged sober looks. This kind of thing didn't happen very often in our town. "Why don't you have a seat and tell us all about it, miss?" the chief asked kindly, gesturing to an empty chair by his desk. She sat down, trembling slightly as if she were cold. The chief asked Pete to go grab a blanket for her, and Pete went to fetch one. The chief offered her coffee, gesturing to the coffee maker on a table across the room. "No, thank you," she said, staring off into space as if in shock. "What's your name, miss?" the chief asked. "Shirley," she answered. "Shirley Ann McDougal." The chief pulled a police report form from his desk and wrote down the name. Pete came back into the office with a blanket, which he offered to Shirley Ann McDougal. She thanked him and wrapped it around her shoulders, but she kept trembling throughout the interview as if she couldn't warm her body. "How old are you, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked. 19. He wrote down that number. "Where do you live?" "Here, in town." "And how long have you lived here?" "All my life." Here the chief frowned a little. He exchanged a look with Pete, who shrugged, and then he looked at me. I shook my head. I could see what was bothering the chief. When you've been a cop in a small town long enough, you get to know most of the people who live in your jurisdiction. I had been a cop for 10 years at that point. Pete, who was older than me, had been one for nearly 20. And the chief, who was older than both of us, had been a cop for almost 40. And yet none of us had ever seen this woman who claimed to have lived here her whole life, nor had we ever heard of her before that night. "What's your address, Miss McDougal?" the chief asked. "I live with my parents in their apartment above the hardware store they own, McDougal's Hardware on Main Street." That was when I knew something very strange was going on. There was no McDougal's Hardware on Main Street. In fact, I had never heard of anyone named McDougal living in the area. The chief was looking at Shirley in a strange way, but he continued doing his job without missing a beat. "Now, Miss McDougal." "You can call me Shirley," she interrupted softly, still staring off into space, distracted. "Shirley, why don't you tell us exactly what happened tonight?" Then she told us, and her story just kept getting stranger and stranger. "I was walking home after seeing a movie. My girlfriends and I went to see the new Martin and Lewis comedy at the Mayan." "Wait a minute." Pete interrupted her at that point, raising his hand. "Sorry, did you say you went to the Mayan?" "Yes, to see Martin and Lewis." "Martin and who?" "You know, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. We went to see their new movie, Partners, which just came out last week." Pete exchanged a glance with me, and his expression was a mixture of confusion and astonishment. He mouthed to me, "What the hell is going on?" Shirley kept talking anyway. "I was about to go into the store, but a man came up to me outside. He was older, maybe in his 40s, with silver hair. He was dressed like a priest, and he had a crutch under one arm. He asked me for help. He said his wallet had fallen under the seat of his car, and he wanted to know if I could help him get it out. He was very polite, seemed harmless, and I felt sorry for him because of the crutch, you know. He led me over to his car." "What kind of car was it, Shirley?" the chief interrupted her. She thought for a few seconds. "I think it was a Buick. Yeah, it was a dark Buick, a couple of years old, maybe from 1953 or 1954. A Buick from 1953 or 1954, which Shirley McDougal said was only a couple of years old. What the hell was this? Was this girl on drugs, or was this just some stupid prank?" "Did you see the license plate, Shirley?" the chief asked. "I only caught a glimpse of it as we passed by. I didn't see the numbers, but I noticed it was an out-of-state car. I think the plate said Oklahoma." "And then what happened, Shirley?" The chief encouraged her to continue. "I bent down and was looking under the driver's seat for the wallet, and then..." She stopped and took a long, shaky breath, then exhaled sharply, as if gathering the courage to remember her terrible experience. "Something hit me on the head. It hit me hard. It was him, the man dressed as a priest. He hit me from behind, I think with the crutch he was carrying. Then he hit me again. I was dazed. I think I even blacked out for a moment. When I woke up, he was dragging me into the back of his car. I tried to fight him, but he slapped me and told me to shut up or he'd kill me. He called me..." She hesitated. I'd rather not repeat what he said. "He lifted the trunk lid and shoved me inside. Then he slammed the trunk closed. I was screaming at the top of my lungs and pounding on the trunk, but he was already back in the car and had started it up. And then he started driving. I was screaming and crying, praying, begging him not to hurt me. I told him I just wanted to see my parents again, but he kept driving. I don't know how long he drove. It was a while, maybe an hour. But then something happened. He had an accident. I heard him yell an alarm, and then the car swerved. I could hear the tires screeching. We went off the road. The next thing I knew, the trunk started filling with cold water. We must have gone into a lake or pond. I was going hysterical, pounding, trying to open the trunk, and then I don't remember anything. Everything went black for a while. The next thing I remember is splashing on the surface of the water. I don't know how I got out. I swam to shore and made my way back to the road, and I just started walking back to town." Finished with her story, Shirley fell silent. She lowered her head, trembling. None of us knew what to say. We stood there trying to make sense of what she had just told us. I looked at Pete, then at the chief. The chief looked back at me with a disturbed expression. "May I use the phone?" Shirley asked, looking up. "I want to call my parents to tell them I'm all right." "Of course, Shirley, just give us a minute. We want to get this man's description out over the radio to issue an alert so we can catch this guy," the chief told her, getting up and motioning for Pete and me to follow him. He led us out of the office and shut the door behind us. "What the hell is this girl saying?" Pete asked. "The Mayan Theater closed down 30 years ago when I was a kid. There's a liquor store there now." "Yeah, and McDougal's hardware disappeared a long time ago," the chief replied. "Long before your time. It burned down when I was a kid back in 67, I think it was, or 68. And the McDougals died in the fire while they were sleeping." Pete and I absorbed that information for a moment. "So what the hell is going on?" I asked. "Is she crazy? Is she on drugs or what?" The chief shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe something really did happen to her tonight, and the trauma caused her to have a psychotic breakdown. Dissociative identity disorder, they call it now." He opened the office door and motioned for us to come back inside. Shirley McDougal, or whoever she really was still sitting by the chief's desk. She looked at us when we walked in. "Can I call my parents now?" she asked urgently. "They must be so worried about me." The chief sat down and studied her carefully. "Shirley," he said, "who is the President of the United States?" She blinked, confused. "What? Dwight Eisenhower, of course. What does that have to do with what happened to me?" The chief stared at her for a long time. "Shirley, do you know what year it is?" She gave him a puzzled look. "Pardon? Do you know what year it is?" the chief asked in a gentle voice. 1956. Why are you asking me this? Are you crazy?" The chief looked at her with compassion. "No, Shirley, it's not 1956, it's 2019. 1956 was 63 years ago." She stared at him, confused. 2019? She muttered incredulously. "What are you saying? This is some kind of prank." "Look at the calendar behind me, Shirley," the chief told her, pointing to the bulletin board on the wall. With a suspicious expression, Shirley stood up and walked over to the calendar. She stood in front of it, staring at it for a long while. Then she stepped back, her eyes widening in disbelief. No. This has to be a trick. It has to be," she muttered, terrified and confused. "Shirley," the chief said, pointing to the computer on his desk. "Have you ever seen one of these before?" But Shirley ignored him. Her attention had shifted to a large map of the United States on the opposite wall. She walked over to it, studying it intensely. "Hawaii? Alaska?" she muttered quietly to herself. Then she walked over to the window and looked outside toward the parking lot. "The cars," she said, her voice rising in panic. "What's wrong with the cars? Why do they look so different?" We stood by the chief's desk, staring at her, astonished, not knowing how to react. Shirley turned to look at us, starting to tremble. She fell to her knees, clutching her stomach, her breathing accelerating as if she were hyperventilating. "I think I'm going to be sick," she muttered in a choked voice. "Please tell me where the ladies' room is. I'm going to be sick." Pete looked at the chief, who nodded with a serious expression. Pete helped Shirley to her feet and led her out of the office. He looked at us again, and the chief signaled for him to keep an eye on her. Pete nodded, and then they disappeared through the door. A long, awkward moment of silence passed, with the chief sitting at his desk, fidgeting distractedly with a piece of his puzzle, and me standing there, both of us trying to process what had just occurred. The entire encounter, from the moment the soaked woman had entered the police station to the moment Pete led her to the bathroom, had lasted no more than 20 minutes. Finally, I broke the silence, letting out a nervous laugh in an attempt to lighten the mood. "Quite a night, huh, Chief?" The chief just grunted in response, as if he were focused on something else. "So who should we call? State police or the hospital?" I asked. The chief didn't respond. He was still lost in his thoughts, staring blankly ahead. "What's on your mind, Chief?" "Something occurred to me a couple of minutes ago," he said, looking over at me with a concerned expression. "She said it was 1956. That was 2 years before I was born, but McDougal's hardware was still around until I was about 9. My parents used to do business with the McDougals, and I remember something from when I was a kid, something I overheard my parents talking about. Something about the McDougal's daughter disappearing under mysterious circumstances. I stared at him, incredulous. Come on, Chief. You're not telling me you actually believe in all this, are you? It wouldn't be the first time something strange has happened in this town, he said, giving me a significant look. I think you know what I'm talking about. I didn't respond, but I knew what he was talking about. In my mind, I flashed back to images I'd rather not remember. A blood-stained motel room, sheets ripped from the bed, bloody claw marks on the carpet, ending abruptly in an empty closet. I shuddered at the memory. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the hallway. Pete was shouting, calling for us to come quickly. Damn it, now what? I muttered as we rushed to the door. Pete was standing outside the ladies' room, visibly upset. She's gone, he said as we approached. What the hell do you mean she's gone? The chief demanded. See for yourself, Pete replied, opening the bathroom door. We looked inside. All 3 bathroom stalls were open, empty. The chief turned to Pete. Where the hell is she? I told you to keep an eye on her. Chief, I swear I stood right here the whole time, Pete insisted, looking anxious and scared. She was cold. What did you say? I asked, not understanding what he had just murmured. I said she was cold, Pete repeated, looking at me. When I helped her up to go to the bathroom, my hand touched her arm. It was so cold, like touching the skin of a corpse. The chief gave me a serious look, one that mirrored my own growing fear. All of this was too similar to what happened in 2014. The chief and I walked into the bathroom and looked around. There wasn't much to see. 3 empty stalls and a sink. There was a small window just above the sink. I walked over to it, sure I would find it closed, but the latch was unhooked. I felt a strange sense of relief seeing that, as if I had been offered a logical explanation, one that allowed me to deny what was really going on. Chief, I said, the window's open. Outside, quick. He gave the order, and Pete and I followed him quickly to the front entrance of the town hall building. We stepped outside and looked around. The only thing we saw was the building's lawn and Main Street beyond, almost deserted on that early summer night. The window to the ladies' room faced the left side of the building. We went in that direction, but when we turned the corner, there was no one there. No trace of the mysterious young woman who called herself Shirley McDougal. I looked up. The window was about 10 feet from the ground, and although small, it wasn't impossible for someone of slender build, like Shirley, to have passed through it. What I'm saying is that it was conceivable she had escaped through the window, fallen to the ground, and then disappeared into the night. The lawn had been freshly mowed and it hadn't rained, so the ground left no visible tracks to determine which direction she had gone. We stood there for a while, staring at that window. Finally, the chief lowered his head and let out a slightly shaky chuckle. She must have closed the window after she jumped. Yeah, or she's lying or drugged or who the hell knows, Pete responded. But that uneasy expression was still present in the chief's eyes, and I think he was trying to rationalize what had just happened as much as I was. Let's go back inside, he told us. And that's exactly what we did. It was easier to believe we had been dealing with a deeply disturbed young woman, or a kook looking for attention, because otherwise we would have to accept that what we had interrogated that night was a ghost. The chief did report the incident to the state police, and they issued an alert to locate her, but nothing ever came of it. We never saw or heard from Shirley Ann McDougal again. I did some research in my spare time, out of pure curiosity, or at least that's what I told myself. I searched online and went through old newspapers and town records. There really had been a young woman named Shirley Ann McDougal, the 19-year-old daughter of Wilbur and Harriet McDougal, owners of McDougal's Hardware. And she really had disappeared one night in early August of 1956, never to be seen or heard from again. But for all I knew, the crazy woman we had dealt with had heard about the case and incorporated the details into her delusion. There were no pictures, if you're wondering. I looked, but I found nothing in the newspapers. I even tried to track down any surviving relatives of Shirley's to no avail. It had been more than 60 years, and presumably all the family photos had been lost in the fire that killed her parents. I pushed all those thoughts out of my mind. I'm a police officer, and there are more pressing matters to deal with. Eventually, I forgot all about my strange encounter with Shirley McDougal. Until last week, when I got to the station to start my usual shift, and the chief motioned for me to come into his office. His face was pale and grave. He didn't say anything, just pointed to the newspaper lying on his desk. I picked it up and read the headline, "Lake reveals dark secret after 66 years. In a nearby town, A man who was testing his new fish-finding sonar accidentally found an old car at the bottom of the lake, about 20 feet down. He notified the police and they pulled the car up to the surface, an old rusted Buick, which had once been from 1953. In the driver's seat, they found a set of skeletal remains that belonged to a man. The license plate on the old Buick was from Oklahoma, and when the authorities ran it, they discovered that the vehicle matched a car registered to a man the FBI had been looking for in the mid-1950s. A drifter and convicted felon they believed was a serial killer, or what they then called a highway killer, suspected of kidnapping and murdering up to 10 young women in 6 different states. His last attempted victim had managed to escape. According to her, a man dressed as a priest had tried to lure her into his car and then overpowered her. This happened in Iowa, a neighboring state to Minnesota. After that, the man simply disappeared from the FBI's radar. When they performed a more thorough inspection of the wrecked Buick, they made another gruesome discovery. In the trunk, they found another skeleton, one that belonged to a young woman. I grew up in this little Nebraska town, and in the 18 years I lived there, only 2 significant things ever happened. The first, and probably the best, is that I was born. I know, you're welcome, everyone. But the second, and perhaps the worst thing that ever happened in our town, was when Calvin Michaels burned down his garage. Or rather, maybe what Calvin did was the worst thing that never happened in our town. And if that doesn't make sense, bear with me. It'll all become clear over the course of the next few paragraphs. It was a Sunday night, and I was a freshman in high school at the time. Still at that age where my friends and I would ride our bikes around in the afternoon. You know, good old-fashioned fun. We were riding around when we saw another kid from our class speeding down the street. We stopped to say hi, and between gasping breaths, the kid told us, "Oh my God, guys, the Michaels garage is on fire, come see it." So we raced down the street, following the kid from our class, until we came upon that blazing inferno that used to be the Michaels family garage. Just as we arrived, the cops and firefighters at the scene immediately told us to stay back. We thought we were already at a safe distance, so we were a bit confused, but we did what we were told. Only then did we start hearing all these explosions and popping sounds coming from the garage, and the firefighters trying to put out the flames ran for cover. I had no idea what was causing those little bursts, but if it was scaring the cops and firefighters, then I figured I should be scared too. I honestly thought the Michaels house was about to explode or something, and so did my friends, so we had no problem getting out of there, hopping on our bikes, and telling our parents about what had happened. The next morning at school, all the kids were talking about the fire, mainly because Calvin Michaels didn't show up to any of his classes. Some kids were spreading rumors, saying they saw paramedics loading him into an ambulance, and that he was so badly burned he was just a smoldering shell. Others said that he and his parents had gone to live with some relatives because the fire had left their house pretty much uninhabitable. A story I believed because I figured there'd be a real confirmation if someone had died. But then, the next morning, there was confirmation. The news report said that firefighters had recovered a body from the burned garage while the surviving members of the family were staying with relatives and had asked the media to give them some space. So by that Tuesday, we knew someone had died, but we had no idea exactly who. The Michaels had 3 generations living in that house, and Calvin was one of 4 kids. A lot more rumors swirled around, and it wasn't until the next day when our principal called us all into a special assembly that we got some concrete answers. I remember the whole school gathering in the gym, where the county sheriff and a handful of deputies were all standing in front of the bleachers, each with very serious expressions on their faces. Once we were seated, the principal started by saying that the county sheriff had something important to tell us. When he stepped forward and took off his hat, I swear you could hear a pin drop. We knew he was going to say something about the Michaels family, but exactly what, I never would have guessed in a million years. I'm not going to pretend I remember word for word what he said. This was almost 20 years ago. But basically, here's what he said. "Kids, you've all heard about the fire at the Michaels house, and I'm sure you've all heard about the tragic loss of life. Well, I hate to be the one to give you this news, but your classmate, Calvin, was the one who passed away." There was kind of a collective gasp in the gym, and the sheriff paused for a second before continuing. "We're still trying to figure out how the fire started, so we're inviting anyone who has any information about Calvin to come forward. You don't have to do it now. You can call my office whenever you like, and we can have a more private conversation. Please, if you have anything to tell us about any strange or unusual behavior Calvin may have shown in the days leading up to the fire, I implore you to come forward." That was the first hint we had that something was really wrong. I guess they wanted to handle everything very carefully, and I can totally understand why they'd want to protect us from what they already knew. The initial reaction was total shock and grief. The kids were horrified that one of their own had died in such a terrible way. But if the cops had told us what they really found there, I don't think people would have been so sad. They would have been angry instead. It took 2 more days for the truth to come out, and by then the town had decided to leave the responsibility to our parents. There was a town meeting. I remember that because my parents asked me to finish my chores before they got back, and the only thing I did was play Perfect Dark for about 2 hours. When they got home, I thought they'd be mad that I hadn't even started doing the things I was supposed to do, but they weren't mad. They had these strange but sad yet intense expressions, exactly the same looks they had when my grandpa died suddenly. They sat me down in the TV room and asked how well I knew Calvin. I told them not much, that I had Spanish class with him, but we never talked. Then they started asking me a bunch of other questions. If Calvin had ever gotten mad at me, if I liked him, stuff like that. In the end, I straight up told them it was obvious they knew something about Calvin and that I'd prefer if they just told me if he had taken his own life or something, because I was old enough to handle the truth. Turns out I wasn't old enough to handle the truth. Calvin didn't take his own life. He accidentally blew himself up while trying to make a bomb. Apparently, he wanted to test his method by making a trial model, but while he was putting it together, he somehow set it off, and it was an explosion strong enough to kill him before it burned down his garage. At first, it seemed like maybe he could have just been an arsonist, like a firebug, and he was just playing with some accelerant or something. That's why it took the cops a few days to be sure what had happened. They had to sift through the burned-out garage and go through Calvin's things to try to figure out why he did it. The cops found a journal Calvin had been keeping, one in which he basically outlined his plan to build a bomb and place it under the church on a Sunday morning while it was packed with families. The cops didn't say exactly what the rest of the journal contained, only that it made for extremely disturbing reading, and that there were several references to the Columbine massacre from the year before. By the end of the conversation, my mom was crying, and my dad was more upset than I'd ever seen him. That kid wanted to kill almost the entire town, and let me tell you, if he'd put the bomb in the church during the upcoming Veterans Day service, he would have killed like 90% of the people in our town, all in one blast. And the closest explanation God gave us was simply that the kid wanted to hurt people. Or maybe he wasn't right in the head. No one really picked on him or treated him badly. I guess he was just crazy. But I also thank God that he wasn't smarter, that he didn't do a little more research or take a little more care, because if he had, he could have wiped our entire town off the map.